When Catherine Morrison, 37 years old, owner of the largest automotive repair chain in the Southwest with a net worth of $200 million, walked into her Phoenix shop dressed as a regular worker and told Michael Carter, her best mechanic, that he was fired for no apparent reason, she expected anger, begging, maybe even insults. What she didn't expect was the response that this 29-year-old mechanic, with hands stained with grease and a paycheck that barely covered rent, would give her. A response so full of dignity and wisdom that it would shatter all the certainties of a woman used to measuring people's worth by their bank accounts. Because Catherine was testing her employees, searching for someone worthy of inheriting her company after a medical diagnosis that gave her only 6 months to live. And that November morning, in a cold Phoenix garage that smelled of motor oil and coffee, an apparently random encounter was about to change 2 destinies in ways that neither of them could have ever imagined. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The November fog wrapped around Phoenix like a grey shroud, hiding the Camelback Mountain that normally stood on the horizon. The desert morning was cold and still, the kind of Arizona winter day that tourists never believe exists. In the industrial district near Sky Harbor, between metal warehouses and old factories converted into luxury lofts, Morrison Auto Repair shone like an exception of efficiency in a sea of mediocrity. It was the crown jewel of an empire of 30 shops scattered across Arizona, Nevada, and California, a business that generated $50 million a year and had made Catherine Morrison one of the most respected entrepreneurs in the American automotive industry. But that morning, Catherine wasn't sitting in her panoramic downtown office with views of the city skyline. She wasn't wearing one of her $3,000 designer suits or driving her Tesla. She had parked 3 blocks away in a rented 2015 Ford Focus, wore faded jeans, an anonymous hoodie, and work boots she'd bought at a thrift store. Her auburn hair, normally perfectly styled, was hidden under a baseball cap. She'd let her roots grow grey for 2 weeks. Nobody would recognize her. 3 months earlier, during a routine checkup, the doctors had found something. Ovarian cancer. Advanced stage. They gave her 6 months, maybe a year, with aggressive chemotherapy that she had refused. Catherine Morrison had spent 37 years building an empire, working 16 hours a day, sacrificing friendships, relationships, a family. She had given up the possibility of being a mother for endless board meetings, had let love slip away for business trips, had lost count of the Thanksgivings spent alone in her office with Chinese takeout, and now time, the only thing money couldn't buy, was slipping through her fingers like Arizona desert sand. She had no heirs, no children, no siblings. Her parents killed years ago by a drunk driver on I-10 outside of Tucson. Her cousins were vultures who only waited for her death to divide the inheritance and sell everything to the highest bidder. Catherine couldn't allow it. She had built this company from nothing, starting from a small shop inherited from her father, a humble man who had taught her that an honest mechanic is worth more than a dishonest businessman, transforming it into something to be proud of. She couldn't let it die with her, so she devised a plan. She would test her employees, those who worked in the field, not the executives in suits and ties she already knew. She wanted to find someone with integrity, honesty, leadership ability, someone who saw beyond immediate profit, someone who understood that a company is made of people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet, someone like her father had been. For 2 weeks, she had infiltrated her shops as a simple worker looking for a job, observing, listening, taking notes. In Las Vegas, she had seen a supervisor scream at an apprentice until he cried over a minor mistake. In San Diego, she had witnessed 2 mechanics inflate a young single mother's bill to triple the real price. She had seen mechanics who scammed clients by padding invoices, managers who mistreated employees, people who stole spare parts to resell them. The picture that emerged made her feel as sick as the disease growing inside her. Her father would have been ashamed. But then, at the Phoenix shop near Sky Harbor, she met Michael Carter. Michael had arrived that morning at 6:30, half an hour before official opening. Catherine had watched through the foggy window as the young mechanic prepared his workstation with meticulous care, checked the tools one by one, organized parts with almost obsessive precision, read the day's work orders, taking time to jot down details in a personal notebook. There was nobody watching him, no supervisor checking, no camera pointing at his corner of the shop. And yet Michael worked as if every customer was the most important in the world, as if every bolt mattered, as if someone was always watching, even if that someone was only his own conscience. During the morning, Catherine had continued observing from different angles. She saw how Michael patiently explained to a young customer why it was important to change the oil regularly, using simple metaphors without condescension. She saw how he helped a new co-worker who couldn't find a part without making him feel incompetent. She saw how he politely refused when another mechanic suggested he recommend an unnecessary battery replacement to a customer. And then came the moment that sealed everything. When an elderly woman arrived with a 20-year-old Honda Civic, worried about a strange noise in the engine, the other mechanics rolled their eyes. Catherine heard them mutter that it was a waste of time, that the car probably wasn't worth what it would cost to fix. It was a job that would pay little and require time. But Michael smiled kindly. Crouched down to be at eye level with the woman who barely reached 5 feet, listened patiently as she nervously explained that this car had belonged to her late husband, checked the vehicle without hurry, with the respect of someone examining something valuable. The problem was simple, a loose belt, 10 minutes of work. Instead of inflating the bill like others would have done, Michael fixed the problem, checked other basic elements without charging extra, and asked for only $25, the minimum. Catherine saw the gratitude in the woman's eyes, the tears she held back as she thanked this young man who had treated her with respect instead of as a nuisance, as someone whose car and whose concerns mattered. And in that moment she knew that perhaps her search had ended. Here was someone who understood what her father had taught her, that every customer brings a story, a need, a trust. But she had to be sure. She had to test Michael, push him to the limit, see what he was really made of. Because handing over a $200 million empire to someone required more than kindness. It required character, strength, integrity under pressure. It required that this goodness wasn't just an act when things were easy, but essence when things got difficult. So Catherine designed the final test. It was almost noon when Catherine approached Michael's station. The young mechanic was working on a BMW 5 Series, his head under the hood, hands moving with surgical precision between cables and components. He had the focused face of someone who truly loves their work, not just doing it for the paycheck at the end of the month. Catherine cleared her throat. Michael looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and smiled with that natural courtesy Catherine had noticed before. Catherine said she was an inspector from headquarters, sent to evaluate the shop's performance. Michael nodded, said he understood, asked if there was a problem. His voice was calm, without a trace of nervousness or fear. Catherine continued with the script she had prepared. She said she had received customer complaints that someone at the shop was doing substandard work, damaging the company's reputation. She said that after careful analysis, she had identified the person responsible. Then, looking Michael directly in the eyes, she spoke the words that should have provoked a reaction. She told him it was him, that Michael Carter was fired effective immediately, that he should collect his things and leave in 10 minutes. Michael's reaction wasn't what Catherine expected. The young man didn't turn pale, didn't start begging, didn't get angry. Instead, he continued wiping his hands with the rag, slowly, while processing the information. His face showed surprise, of course, but also something deeper. Acceptance, perhaps. Or that strange calm of someone who has already faced worse storms. Michael asked if he could know exactly what the complaints were, not to argue them, but to understand where he had failed. Catherine improvised, said there had been reports of poorly executed work, delays in deliveries, unprofessional behavior with customers. Michael nodded slowly. He said he understood that the company had to make difficult decisions, that reputation was important. He said that if he had really disappointed customers, then perhaps it was right for him to leave. But then he added something that shook Catherine's certainties. He said that, however, he wanted to make sure that the customers whose cars he was working on today didn't get left without their vehicles. He asked if he could at least finish the work in progress, call the customers to explain the situation, make sure someone else took over their cases. He didn't want to leave anyone in a bind. Catherine was speechless. This man, who believed he had been unfairly fired, was still thinking about the customers. Not about himself, not about losing his job, not about how he would pay his bills, about the customers. But Catherine couldn't stop there. She had to push further, see how far Michael's integrity went. So she hardened her tone and said no, he had to leave immediately, that they would take care of the customers, that it was no longer his problem. Michael hesitated, then said he at least wanted to talk to the customers, explain personally. Catherine refused again, more harshly. She said he was wasting time, that the decision was final, that every additional minute was trespassing on private property. And here came the response that changed everything. Michael put down the rag and removed his gloves with slow and deliberate gestures. He looked at Catherine with eyes that didn't contain anger, but a deep sadness of someone who has known injustice, but has chosen not to let it define him. He said he accepted the firing, but wanted that supposed inspector to know something. For 5 years, he had worked there not just for the paycheck, but because he believed that fixing a car was a service. Each vehicle brought with it someone's life, the father who had to feed his children, the mother who had to take the child to school, the elderly person for whom that car was the only freedom remaining. He had seen too many mechanics treat cars like cash cows, inflating bills, replacing unnecessary parts. He had chosen to be different because every night he had to look in the mirror and recognize the man reflected back. Then he revealed something that hit Catherine like a punch. His father had died 3 years ago because a dishonest mechanic did superficial work on the brakes.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
Since that day, he had made a promise on his grave. He would never allow his negligence to put someone's life at risk. Every bolt he tightened, he did thinking that somewhere a son was waiting for his father to come home. Catherine felt something break inside her. All her certainties, her cynicism, her pride, crumbled before the disarming sincerity of this young man who was losing his job but not his dignity. Michael concluded by asking to carry a message to Catherine Morrison. She had built something beautiful. She had the power to make a difference, and he hoped she would never forget that behind every customer there was a human being who deserved honesty and respect. Then he turned to collect his tools, shoulders curved but head still high. And Catherine Morrison, who hadn't cried since her parents' death 15 years ago, felt her eyes burn. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Catherine removed her cap and hoodie, revealing the designer shirt underneath. Michael turned confused and recognized the face he had only seen in photographs. Catherine Morrison, the owner. Color drained from Michael's face, not from fear, but from understanding he had been deceived, tested like a lab rat. Catherine raised a hand, asking for just a minute to explain. She told about the cancer, the 6 months she had left, the desperate need to find someone worthy of continuing her legacy. She told of the weeks infiltrating the shops, the corruption found everywhere, and how that morning she had finally found what she was looking for. Catherine offered him everything: the position of general manager, a salary multiplied by 10, ownership of the company after her death. She said that in Michael she had seen the only man worthy of continuing what she had begun. But Michael shook his head. He was honored, but he couldn't accept. Not after being deceived and tested like an experiment. He said that honesty and respect shouldn't be tested with deception, but recognized with trust. If Catherine had really wanted to know him, she could simply have talked to him as a human being instead of hiding behind a mask. The words were a gentle but firm reproach. Catherine, for the second time, realized how arrogant she had been. She sat on a work stool, suddenly exhausted. She said Michael was right, that she had been an idiot, that fear of death had made her desperate, and desperation had made her cruel. And then she did something she hadn't done in 30 years of business career. She apologized, sincerely, deeply, without conditions. She told Michael she had been wrong, that if he wanted to leave, she would understand. Michael looked at this woman who had all the money in the world but was losing time, and saw not an arrogant billionaire, but a scared human being desperately trying to leave something good behind. And in that understanding, he found forgiveness. Michael sat on the stool facing Catherine, and for long minutes both remained silent, surrounded by the familiar noise of the shop. Michael spoke first. He said he accepted the apology, but that didn't change the fundamental problem. Catherine needed someone to take over the company, and Michael didn't feel qualified. He was a mechanic, not an executive. He knew how to fix engines, not manage spreadsheets. Catherine smiled for the first time since revealing her identity. She said that was precisely the point. She had experienced managers, brilliant accountants, expensive lawyers. What she didn't have was someone with integrity, someone who understood that a business is made of people, not numbers. Technical details can be learned. Character cannot. But Michael was still reluctant. Catherine proposed a compromise, that he take time to think about it seriously. Meanwhile, she would offer him a promotion to supervisor of that shop with a substantial raise, to see if he liked the management side. No pressure, no tests, just the opportunity to grow at his own pace. Michael reflected. Then he asked for something that again surprised Catherine. He said he accepted, but with one condition. He wanted Catherine to spend those 6 months she had left, not hiding behind masks or tests, but truly living. Time was too precious to waste in offices and meetings. He proposed they work together, side by side. Catherine would teach Michael the business, and Michael would remind Catherine why she had started in the first place. They would visit the shops not as inspectors, but as people, meeting employees, listening to their stories, reconnecting with the reason everything began. Catherine felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the hope of beating the disease. She knew that battle was lost. But the hope of giving meaning to the time she had left, of transforming her last months into something more than a countdown to the end. She accepted. And in that moment, among tools dirty with grease and the smell of burnt rubber, an unlikely partnership was born that would transform not only a company, but the lives of everyone who was part of it. The following months were the most intense and meaningful of Catherine's life. Every morning she arrived at the shop not in a Tesla, but in a Focus, like her employees. She worked alongside Michael, learning again what it meant to get her hands dirty, talk with customers, solve concrete problems instead of abstract strategies. Michael flourished in his new role. He discovered he had a natural talent for leadership, not the authoritarian kind, but the kind that inspires people to give their best. The employees at the Phoenix shop started working with more passion. Customers returned in increasing numbers, not just for the service, but for the atmosphere of honesty and care that permeated every interaction. Catherine implemented the changes Michael suggested: bonuses for honesty instead of just profits, mandatory ethics training, customer feedback systems that rewarded transparency. And slowly, shop by shop, the corporate culture began to change. 5 months after that first encounter, Catherine was sitting in her office with views of the Phoenix skyline, but this time she wasn't alone. Michael was there with her, along with lawyers and notaries, to sign the documents that would transfer ownership of the company. Not after Catherine's death, but immediately. Catherine had decided she wanted to see Michael take the reins, wanted to be there to guide him in the first steps, not leave him alone with an inheritance he hadn't asked for. The documents were signed. Michael Carter became the owner of 70% of Morrison Auto Repair, with Catherine keeping 30% to be divided among various charitable organizations after her death. But more important than the documents was the spiritual testament Catherine had written, a letter that would be read to all employees. In that letter, Catherine told the story of how she found Michael, of the cruel test and the lesson in humanity she received. She told how a young mechanic had taught her that true success isn't measured in millions earned, but in lives positively touched. She asked employees to follow Michael's example, to remember that behind every car there was a person, and that their work had the power to protect or endanger those lives. 3 weeks after signing, Catherine Morrison died, surrounded not by lawyers and business people, but by Michael, who held her hand until the end. In her last moments of consciousness, Catherine had whispered a thank you, not just for accepting the inheritance, but for reminding her what it meant to be human. The funeral was a strange event. There were the powerful of the industry, sure, but there were also hundreds of mechanics, customers, ordinary people whom Catherine had touched in the last months of her life. People who didn't know her as the distant billionaire, but as the woman who had worked alongside them, who had listened to their stories, who had demonstrated that change is possible at any age and in any circumstance. Michael gave the eulogy. He spoke of a woman who had the courage to admit she was wrong, to change, to grow even while dying. He spoke of how Catherine had taught him that intelligence in business is important, but integrity is essential, and that true luxury isn't owning 20 cars, but having the peace of knowing you've lived according to your values. The following years saw Morrison Auto Repair transform into something unique in the American landscape. Michael implemented revolutionary policies, bonuses for mechanics who reported incorrect practices, automatic discounts for elderly and low-income families, partnerships with technical schools to train young mechanics according to principles of ethics and excellence. The company grew not because it sought profit at any cost, but because customers trusted, employees worked with passion, and word of mouth did the rest. Michael never married, not for lack of opportunities, but because he had found his purpose in carrying forward Catherine's legacy. He opened a foundation in his mentor's name, dedicated to ethical training in the automotive sector and supporting families who had lost loved ones in accidents caused by mechanical negligence, as had happened to his father. 10 years after Catherine's death, Michael was at a newly opened shop in Denver. During the opening ceremony, a 19-year-old mechanic approached nervously. He said he had heard the story of how Michael became owner of the company, and that it had inspired him to become a mechanic, not just to make a living, but to make a difference. Michael looked at that kid and saw himself 10 years earlier, young, full of ideals, willing to believe that honesty could still mean something in a cynical world. And in that moment, he understood why Catherine had done all this, not to save a company, but to start a chain of goodness that would continue long after both of them were gone. That evening, after everyone had left, Michael sat in his office and looked at the framed photograph on the desk. It showed him and Catherine in the Phoenix shop, both dirty with grease, both smiling. Catherine had died a year after that photo, but her legacy was more alive than ever. Michael took out his phone and wrote a post on the company's social media. It was simple, without rhetoric, but captured the essence of everything he had learned. He wrote that a person's value isn't measured in what they own, but in what they give. That true success isn't how high you climb, but how many people you bring with you on the journey, and that the greatest legacy you can leave isn't a full bank account, but a world slightly better than how you found it. The post was shared thousands of times. But for Michael, the real reward wasn't in likes or comments. It was knowing that somewhere, in one of the 30 shops that now made up Morrison Auto Repair, a mechanic was treating a customer with honesty and respect, and that Catherine, wherever she was smiling. Because some legacies aren't measured in dollars, but in changed lives. And the most important test isn't the one others give you, but the one you give yourself every day, choosing to be a person you're proud of when you look in the mirror. If this story made you believe that integrity is worth more than money, leave a little heart down below to let me know. And if you really want to support stories like this, that talk about real people with real hearts in a world that often forgets what truly matters, you can leave a little thank you from the heart through the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Michael's response on that November day that changed everything, because you chose to stay until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonists of this story.